Hey everybody, welcome back to your Full Crew podcast. I am Dawn Zoldi, one of your co-hosts.
And I'm Mike Peel, your other co-host. We're going to have some great conversations today. Good topics have been brought up by our guests. We're going to be talking about some robot police out of South Korea, so stay tuned. That'll be at the end. We're going to be talking about a roadmap for advanced air mobility. We're also going to be talking about the DoD's open architecture plan. And finally, we're also going to be talking about some natural language commands for robotics that just came out of Google. Want to briefly thank our sponsors, SAIC, Speedbird Aero, Robert T. Hastings, and Fixar for making this podcast possible. And remind our audience you can participate and ask our guest questions. And that does bring us to our guests. So we've got Bob Hastings. Bob, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Good morning. I currently lead a consultancy that focuses on defense, aerospace, and mobility. I've launched that after about 40 years in industry in the military, where I've done everything from being a actually an Army helicopter pilot to, at one point, had the honor of being Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs, and finished out my career with Bell, which is where I developed this deep interest in this really exciting next generation of aircraft that are coming to us that I'd like to talk about today, advanced air mobility.
Well, it's great to have you. And we also have our first repeat guest on the crew, John McHale. So, John, tell us a little bit about yourself. Oh, you're muted.
Thank you very much, Dawn and Mike. Good to be back again. I've been covering this industry, the defense electronics industry, for close to 30 years. And currently I am the editorial director for Military Embedded Systems magazine, where we cover everything that's embedded in terms of electronics, hardware, software that goes into a defense system. And today I'm going to be talking about the trend we're seeing from a lot of our readers and also from our advertisers as well, is the push towards open architectures within the Department of Defense and the mandate that came out a few years ago for a modular open systems approach, better known as MOSA.
Well, excited to talk about that. As you know, I work with Drone Code Foundation as a consultant, and so I'm a big fan of open architecture in general. I can't wait to see what's going on there. But first, we're going to be talking about Bob's article. Actually, it's a paper, Roadmap of Advanced Air Mobility Operations. So tell us why you chose this.
Yeah, so it was just published by the Helicopter Association International. HAI is the world's largest trade association for helicopter operations. It includes everybody from pilots to operators to the supply chain. And it focuses on trying to professionalize and like most trade associations, works on legislative issues, safety issues, regulatory issues, supply chain issues. And this year, I was pretty excited at Heli Expo, which is the world's largest trade show for helicopters earlier this year, to see this publication released and to see how Helicopter Association International has really this year embraced this new wave of air mobility called advanced air mobility. AAM, if you're not familiar with it, just for a quick history, it is the next wave of vertical takeoff aircraft that will be able to operate largely at much reduced costs, much higher operations, and within urban areas because they're electric. And what electric gives you is the ability to put vertical aircraft right into the heart of urban areas. As many people know, heliports are noisy. Communities don't like heliports. Cities like San Francisco have, somewhere in the range of 28 or 29 heliports, and most of them have been closed over the years. I think there's one operating heliport still left in San Francisco, and it's because of the noise issue. So battery technology, electric technology has reached the point where we can now build electric vertical aircraft. And the concept is, if we can get adoption as high as some of the estimates are to get these aircraft into the thousands, that the cost comes down so much that you can actually get in an urban air mobility aircraft and go to the airport for about the same price you'd pay for a taxi or an Uber. So it's a really exciting time. I chose this paper. What I'd love to discuss a little bit is actually the infrastructure part. There's about 50 or 60 OEMs, original equipment manufacturers, that are building something that will fly. That will, as most industries go, that'll scoot down to, maybe 10 that will actually be successful and go into production. But the infrastructure side has got to grow significantly in order for these to work. I'll give you an example. If you have a vertiport, which is what they're calling them, in an inner city, and you want to have 10 or 12 or 20 movements an hour, takeoffs and landings, and then you start doing some math about, well, is that aircraft on the ground for 10 minutes? Well, 10 minutes at the best means that one pad gives you 6 movements. You want to do 20 movements, you want to do 30 movements, all of a sudden you're thinking about a much larger facility. They're electric, so you got to have high voltage power going to it. They're in the inner city, so you got to think about traffic and congestion and buildings and other things that are going on. So I think we're really at the cusp of having to really significantly invest in our infrastructure so that we're ready for these thousands of new aircraft that'll be in the air in a pretty short time.
Mike, you're muted.
We've got a comment from Olga at Aristobal. Sorry if I got your name wrong. Good morning, everyone. So nice to see you, Olga, and anybody else who'd like to join in, please do. John, what are your thoughts on the advanced air mobility roadmap?
We are having mute problems today. I'd say just everybody keep your
So,
mic hot. Just keep them hot.
I
Just,
appreciate that.
Hands off the mute button.
Hands off the mute button.
We're trying to be respectful of our colleagues' quiet, but we can't seem to get it turned back on. I started reading the report a little bit. And I also go to a lot of defense shows, and I've seen the different examples of the advanced air mobility platforms that are out there. Specifically, Bell, they always put on a really nice presentation at their extremely large booth with one of the platforms out there. But what I'm seeing and what our readers are talking about in terms of advanced air mobility is how to certify the avionics and the flight controls. So we kind of get that into the mix a little bit, whether it's from a vertical takeoff and landing standpoint, also from how do you make these also uncrewed, and from a military standpoint, how can they fit into their manned unmanned teaming. Sorry, I'm going to go back and forth between crewed, uncrewed, autonomous. So there's a lot of different ways to describe that, or RPAs. But that's the big trends that our readers are looking at. Is from a safety certification standpoint, there are some tricky things there. Now, the military doesn't require safety certification, but if they're flying in civil airspace, they kind of want to be on board. And secondly, it makes the aircraft more reliable, so why not do it? So that's kind of what we're looking at there. That's kind of what I'm
So I would think there's probably, and I don't know if I'm going to say breakthrough, some may disagree with me, but I see it as a breakthrough. I've been following this advanced air mobility since about 2018, which is when Bell revealed that we were working on it. Some of the companies like Joby and Eve and Archer will tell you they've been working on it even longer than that. But what I saw this year for the first time at both Heli Expo, and then I went from Heli Expo right to South by Southwest, and there was even more AAM activity at South by than there was at Heli Expo. But what I saw this time, which was starkly different, was significant FAA participation. Just about every panel that I went to, whether it was AAM leadership, AAM infrastructure, AAM certification, AAM business case, all across the board, there was an FAA representative sitting on that panel. And the FAA, I think, has really embraced the concept, and they have their own working group with all the participants from manufacturers in, and they're working very hard to make sure that we can get these aircraft certified and that they'll be safe to operate. From the manned unmanning point of view, all of the manufacturers that I've talked to, with one exception, is planning to put a pilot in the aircraft when they first start AAM operations. And most of them are talking about a decade or more before they even think about going autonomous. The one exception that I know of is Wisk, which is the Boeing subsidiary working on it. Wisk is still sticking to an unmanned strategy right now, but everybody else is in a 4 or 5 passenger with a pilot in the cockpit for some time.
Yeah, I was going to say, so we'll keep watching Wisk out in Australia and New Zealand, because I think that's where a lot of their autonomous operations are focused right now, given the regulatory environment. Bob, it's great to hear the FAA was involved in all of these panels, because frankly, they need to be. And Last week was somewhat of a blur. I was in a Part 107 training class, but I remember at some point throughout the week, I did see the White House had released some kind of a strategy document that gave a shout out to advanced air mobility. Apologize, I don't remember that off the top, but I think this is a great document you selected here, Bob, from HAI. I love the fact that this is a traditional kind of helicopter focused organization that's reaching out to the AAM community. They see the synergies. One line in here that stuck out in my mind when they talked about airspace was integration, not separation.
Right.
I mean, that is, so when you think about, all the things that need to be addressed, you mentioned infrastructure. John mentioned, something in his bailiwick, which is the certification of the avionics and the control systems, those embedded systems, airspace integration, route development, digital flight rules is a term we're going to hear more and more. They talk in this document about aircrew and operating rules, insurance coverage, public acceptance. I mean, you name it, they addressed it in this document. And so I would commend it to everybody's attention. And the other thing I would say is when you think about vertiports and who's been talking about this like forever, I'm going to give a shout out to my buddy Rex Alexander, CEO and president of 5 Alpha. Rex is one of the world premier, one of the dominant thought leaders in this area. And he's put out so many publications. And I know he was at least the Heli Expo on a number of those panels you just mentioned, Bob. So yeah, follow Rex Alexander if you're not and you're interested in vertiport infrastructure, because that is something Rex has been talking about for a long time. Hey, Mike, what do you think?
Well, I think I always learn from Rex whenever we have him on the show. That's for sure.
Yes.
I mean, for topics that are very complex and nuanced, I do recommend following him, because he has a way of really reducing it down to the simplest, most understandable kind of components. So, but just thinking about one of the things that Bob had mentioned about noise and how that could deeply affect the industry. I don't know if anybody saw Zipline's release. What was it, last week, Dawn?
Yeah, it was.
But it was nice to actually hear how quiet they were able to get that small UAV to be. And I think that's one of the things that has to be solved for AAM to be adopted at any scale and actually do better than what the helicopter industry did in terms of being able to transport people is the sound component. And honestly, we know that electric engines actually, they run at a higher frequency and tend to be generally quieter because that higher frequency doesn't travel as far. So yeah, I think that's going to be important for adoption. I think that's actually one of the critical pieces that we've gotten over. Energy consumption is not, though. I think that's something that's still kind of being worked out. And we've had, who did we have on that is working on hydrogen power?
Oh, Dr. Anita Sengupta.
Yes,
yeah.
Dr. Anita Sengupta. So I think what's great is to see a traditional helicopter organization like HIA actually, like Dawn said, look at integration. I mean, that's because we're talking about alternative fuel sources or energy sources. We're talking about an evolution of pathfinding systems and autopilots that's going to make this tenable. I think we've reached a breaking point where everybody just kind of understands the linear path we're going to take, and that makes it a lot easier to invest in, especially in an environment like now where investments are drying up for the more kind of unrealistic startups. So happy to hear it. What were you going to say, Bob?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think you hit on a couple of key points there, and one of them is the timing. So, a couple of things have happened. One is battery technology. So it's not perfect yet. I mean, batteries are still too big. They're still too heavy. They still take too long to charge. But they have advanced to the point where it allows these manufacturers to design systems that are viable, that will actually fly. And the other one is noise. So Joby in particular. So Joby's, most people are voting on Joby being the sort of the lead horse here. with a couple others that are very close behind. But Joby's got a great presentation they take around where they have actually recorded the noise levels of about a half a dozen different helicopters doing approaches, and then trucks and trains and other things that make noise. And then they play their aircraft, and it's just stark how quiet it is. And they've got a sound chart. So helicopters taking off, they get louder than 85 decibels, which is, where hearing damage can be recorded. And that's where people really get upset. And then you put these electric vehicles that are down in the range of 5 decibels, 5 to 10 when they're taking off at 100 yards away from you. It's just dramatic how quiet they are. And that's really the key. What's enabling, I think, this whole advanced air mobility movement is sound, right? I don't think anyone argues that vertical lift has so many options, right? Police and air ambulances and cargo delivery and maybe even air taxis. But it's just the noise that makes it hard for communities to accept their operations. If you can land 100 yards away from somebody and not hear it in their house, people are going to, I think, have less objections. One of the key things, and I think it was actually Rex who said it, in the United States today, we need to stop or at least freeze the closing of heliports if we can right now across the board. They're being closed right and left. And a heliport that's closed will never become a vertiport. I mean, that's a community that has decided they've had enough, and trying to reverse those trends is difficult. Heliports, interesting enough, are not regulated in the United States. 99% of them, it's an incredible number. 99% of the heliports in the US are privately owned and operated, which means they have no regulatory oversight whatsoever. And so as we bring on vertiports in the hundreds or maybe thousands, there's a regulatory piece there that really needs to be looked at, so that you build your heliport on the left of my house, someone else doesn't build one on the right of my house, and then we have a conflict.
Yeah, no kidding.
Exactly.
Wow, we could talk all day long about this, to be sure. And everybody go to HAI, look up this white paper just released February 2023 and discussed widely at their event in the last over the last couple of weeks in Atlanta. But
we
Mike,
got a comment from Rex, actually. So he said, thanks, Don. 5 Alpha had a hand in developing HAI's roadmap to AAM.
And before we transition, super quick, hydrogen lady, Danielle McLean was also on this show. She started an organization
she was
called
one of our
High
early
Sky,
guests.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So the sound thing, not a scientific analysis, but it's the difference between a dubstep concert and a classical violin. So moving on to John's article. So John, tell us a little bit about MOSA, open architecture, and the DoD.
Sure. And actually, to change and transition more from what Bob talked about, I'm glad to hear the FAA staying on top of this and out there, because I think basically the proliferation of personal drones, personal unmanned aircraft, that kind of the genie was out of the bottle, and they were playing catch up with regulations, and kind of with the DoD they're kind of playing catch up in how they embrace commercial technology, and that's led towards the push towards open architectures and what we call modular open systems approach. In 2019, the 3 services created a big joint memo that was called the MOSA mandate. And essentially, they said it's a warfighting priority that you have to have every new system, every new platform, every upgrade needs to have some type of a MOSA approach to it. Now, MOSA is not a panacea. It's not going to solve every problem. But basically, years ago when they first started talking on this, before they actually framed it all under the MOSA mandate, they called it, there were a couple different ones floating around. One's called FACE. Yes, it's acronym soup. I'm going to warn you now. The Future Airborne Capability Environment, which is an avionics one. They have SOSA, which is a Sensor Open Systems Architecture. Speaks for itself. It's about sensors. Those 2 were examples of early ones that were coming about. And some of the early presentations talk about how the F-35 and the cost of software code kept getting higher and higher and higher, hundreds of millions of dollars. And it's just not sustainable for future aircraft, future platforms to spend that much money. I remember one general said, you can't predict how much one software is going to fail. You can't. He's right. So you got to find a way to reuse components across multiple platforms with common interfaces, whether it's a software interface or whether it's a hardware interface. That's kind of what's inspiring some of this. And then I picked this article because I wrote this. I hosted an event online on called MOSA Virtual Summit, kept it simple. But the gentleman who was our keynote speaker, he's one of the more eloquent, I guess you could say, fans of MOSA within the Department of Defense. He was running EW within Office of Undersecretary of Defense. And now I'm going to read his title to him because he's got a new one. It's Dave Tremper. He's Director of Acquisition, Integration, Interoperability for the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense. And he's a huge MOSA proponent. But what I liked about this presentation is he gave his usual enthusiasm and why it works. He talked about how it got developed, but he also laid out some of the things that he's heard from people within the community and why it's worked. Like the cost to generate proposals has gone down. Those who are embracing it, I mean, for non-recurring engineering compounds, billions of dollars in savings when multiple companies apply these things across multiple programs. You can get a high TRL, which is called a technology readiness level, a lot more quickly than you could in the past, where it would take years. Now it's months. And but they also talked about examples of when the typical people. Well, if you guys know the Department of Defense, I know Bob and Don do. They don't like change. Okay, so
No.
I go into this on a column I wrote last month, where I was talking about budgets and where open architectures fit, and I kind of dived into the Wayback Machine, looking at some of those complaints from the 80s about the bloated defense budgets and the $5,000 hammers and toilet seats. But to get more technology into the warfighter more quickly, you have to find a way. You can't change the DoD acquisition process. Everybody talks about speeding it up. I don't think they can. You got to create new elements within the DoD acquisition behemoth landscape, whether it's the SoftWorks, whether it's the defense, the
TIU.
The Defense Innovation Unit, MathWorks. Yeah.
MathWorks, all that stuff that Dawn and I have done joint presentations with those guys. Whether it's OTAs, other transactional authorities, those are different ways to get around it, but to get things more quickly to the warfighter. Another way is within the programs themselves is to apply open architectures and common interfaces. So when you want to upgrade something, you can get it done more quickly. And what he argues about is that a lot of these naysayers within the DoD will come up to a program manager or high-level DoD person, and who's not as technical as some of the regular open architecture proponents. He doesn't have that comeback. He doesn't have that quick understanding. So, well, no, that's not really true. And he gave an example of a red herring that these things won't support legacy requirements. It's not mature enough. As soon as the chancellors change, will be obsolete. He goes, those are all false. But if they're not armed with the argument to give it back, they're not going to do as well. And he also called for what's really going to help is if you come up with, they can get quantifiable examples of to senior leadership of where they show maybe $5 million, $20 million of savings, or they've cut down development time by 16 months. Things like that will really help push these things forward and help them become part of a program of record. Now, that's not going to happen overnight either, because the biggest one of all with the most momentum is that one I mentioned earlier called SOSA, where the Sensor Open Systems Architecture. And that's still set up as conformance program. They have 1.0 standard is out for the technical standard, but there's still forces moving forward on that. But I think as we look at the DoD, as we talk about the budgets that are coming up, how we equip the warfighter, and it goes into other topics Dawn's talked about too, where you have, there she is hiding behind her coffee mug.
I know.
No, her AI camera is having.
So I got an AI camera, and it does some weird things. Like, so when I put my coffee mug down, it followed my mug.
So unintended consequences.
This is showstopping right there.
I love AI, baby.
Yeah. So this is
our AI future.
This is our AI future. Yeah, AI. That's open architectures right there for you. So easily install your AI camera, and you can follow Dawn everywhere she goes. So, but no, but it's an imperative that we get these examples out there. But it will save money in the long run. I believe in it. But I think I caution people, say, well, it'll never work. I said, it won't work for everything. There are some things that are going to still need custom design from the ground up, very classified systems. But even within classified systems, there are open architectures. You just don't hear about them because it's classified.
I would love Bob's perspective on this with his career in the Army and then, of course, the Texas National Guard. By the way, if you didn't see Bob's full tilt leadership talk, you need to go back and find that because it was amazing. We talked all about his journey and where he got to where he is, but also as Brigadier General in the Texas National Guard, as well as time in the Army. So what do you think about this, Bob?
So I'm a big fan of MOSA. I think, so first of all, that's what lets this thing work, right?
Yeah.
That's ARM, right?
If you think about MOSA in our lives, for someone who's trying to figure it out, it's the ability to go in there and just, decide that you want Excel on your iPhone and you can do it. I think one of the other big advantages of MOSA is it overcomes vendor lock. one of the problems DoD's had with big platforms for years, and I don't mean to think anyone's nefarious about this, but if you bought a, Generation X prime contractor fighter jet, all of the avionics and systems and sensors and everything that's in that thing got put in there by the prime contractor, and the profit margin is there for the prime contractor to hold on to all of that architecture. And by having MOSA design products from the beginning, it allows the military to come back in and say, okay, the APR 39 is great, but there's an APR 40 on the market. So let's just swap it out and put it in the aircraft. And then MOSA, one of the things it does is let you plug and play with the systems as they come in. And I think over the years, it'll make the military acquisition system much more responsive to the needs of the military and better able to embrace innovation and entrepreneurship from the supply chain.
It's tied. You're absolutely right. The primes, and I've heard this from within DoD leadership, even some of the actual groups within the DoD and the primes, they're tied to what is called a 20th century business model that you kind of just described. And moving on to, there's examples of even within, let's say, a prime contractor, Lockheed. I'm using Lockheed as an example. I'm not saying this is Lockheed's example, but where they have two big programs and the programs are so siloed and designed that they can't even talk to each other, the engineering teams, or let alone the actual electronic system. So, and then that goes even further. Well, and Trimper gives an example of this within the DoD. He was working on an electronic warfare system for submarines, and they wanted to apply it to the tactical air component, but they had to start completely all over again instead of just porting the same technology over to tactical air. And he says it creates so much time, more time and more cost that was unnecessary.
Makes no sense. Mike, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, I kind of have two fronts that I really want to talk about this topic on. Just start with the easier one. What John was talking about, this vendor locking is really a kind of a lack of ecosystem governance, because what happens is basically you're wasting human labor, reinventing the wheel, like sometimes literally base level systems that are so essential that they shouldn't be rewritten or locked in a proprietary manner, that the protocol or whatever the communication between components is should just be the same across all vendors if possible, so that then that human innovation, the time spent on it can literally be focused on advancing the entire sphere, or just coming up with completely novel components that could actually make the difference. So there's that, like wasting human labor. And the other thing is actually thinking about how we audit things in the Department of Defense that's actually beneficial to the Department of Defense, because I mean, they failed 5 audits now. And I know that used to be kind of like a peacenik position, like, oh, well, but the truth is it's actually an optimization thing for the Department of Defense to have good books, because then they can decide more intelligently which things actually need more budget, need to be promoted and advanced. So I think this kind of covers both, even if one of it was an unintended one. What were you going to say, Don?
As I read this, John, and my thought was, here we have a director from the Office of Undersecretary of Defense asking essentially the little guys. Okay, so the whole modular open systems architecture, as he notes in his talk, can benefit smaller companies, entrepreneurs, get out of just all the big primes, give people a chance to get involved, increase innovation. They're not in a position to know what the savings are. Like, they have no flipping clue. Like, honestly, and I'll just say it, I was a little bit offended to have a senior leader in the Pentagon foisting this, basically this idea that, hey guys, you have to tell us what the metrics are and how you are helping us save money so I can convince other people in the building. It's like, no, man, that's your job. Like, your job in OSD is to create those metrics. So put it out to the contractors and say, here are some things we're looking at. Tell us how you're meeting or not meeting these, right? Because, I mean, 28 years combined service in the Air Force, I routinely had to create metrics, not only for my own, and this is in a legal office. I'm not even buying big, programs like this. So, I just think it's a little bit unfair to tell the little guys out there, like, hey, you guys, it's kind of your responsibility to help us help you. Now, to a certain extent, they can, but they don't know that a proposal cost has gone down 75%. They don't know that, what it used to take, that now it only took 6 months. All they know is that it took them 6 months. That's it. So, that bird's eye view, I think those people sitting on that perch have that obligation to create those metrics, to proactively gather that information if they want their program to survive. So that's all I'll say. I'll get off my high horse.
I'm with you. I see where you're coming from with that. And if it was, I don't think he was just addressing it to the small business folks. I think he was addressing it to all the open architecture proponents within the DoD, within the open architecture community. Get us those use cases, work with us on that. So I don't think he was just calling out the newbies. I think he was calling out not just the new small businesses, but the primes. There are people in the primes who actually like it too. And also those within the DoD. If get us these examples, then there is one, and the Army's probably done the best job of this. In fact, it was an Army colonel from the EWPEO who talked to me about, if I can get, he gave me an example. If we have one program, whether it's a ground vehicle or whatever it was, typically it would cost me $50 million to upgrade it. But if I apply MOSA and SOSA to it, I can get that down to $5 million. And the Army's also really invested in another open architecture called CMOS, which I'm not going to spell out because it's a really long one. The C is actually an acronym of 5 other words. So
of course it is.
Of course it is. So, but that has been a really successful one too, and that's kind of tied to SOSA. So the Army's been really, really pushing this, probably more than the other services, and they're getting some metrics back. But a lot of it, and I do see what you're saying, because some folks within the standards community says we need more time to come up with some of these metrics because we're still just getting these things required and conformed. And just one note, there's a quick note within SOSA. They don't call it compliance. Compliance is when you can do it yourself. Conformance is when you have to go to another authority to make sure you're doing it. And you can also be aligned, which means you're ready to start the conformance process. So there's a lot of language in there too to understand, which I'm sure as an attorney, Dawn can probably make even more fun. So.
All right. Well, Mike, I think it's time for our sponsor recognition here.
Yeah, we just want to take a quick break to thank SAIC, Speedbird Aero, Fixar, and Robert T. Hastings for sponsoring the podcast and making it possible. Also, thank you to the chat for participating quite a bit today. I wanted to bring up Chris Byers. He said the PPBE process is a major constraint for DoD acquisition, but there are several people really trying to work through the constraint. Change is hard in the DoD acquisition space for sure. But yeah, so I think we kind of addressed that as clearly as we could. So, but thank you for the comment, Chris. And we also have one from Women in Drones. So I'm sure that's from our friends over there. Hi, Dawn and Mike. Great conversation. They're apologizing for needing to drop off. They have a client meeting, but they want us to keep up the great work, and we will. So the next article is from me. So Google released Palm E. So Palm was one of their large language model software releases. What's interesting about this is it's called Embodied Multimodal Language Model, and it, in the clearest way I could describe it, robots can understand what you're saying to them, interpret it, and then do the action. So rather than having to be super descriptive and explicit, like move 2 meters left, then raise arm, grab this at that angle, you could just say, get me the green bag, as is kind of illustrated here in this image, if it'll pop up. There you go. It could even handle adversarial kind of constraints. So you saw that sneaky worker over there move the green bag into the drawer out of the robot's initial line of sight. And it was able to determine, okay, green bag is moved to drawer. Now I can move it back to the table. So I think this is actually a significant advancement in the way that we will interact with robots, because one of the things we've kind of discussed here is stuff like elder care. If a robot could actually determine that the person around it is behaving a certain way, it can actually intelligently move out of the way or in the way to help that person. So when you think about what's been going on with AI, with ChatGPT, it can be hard sometimes to see how that's going to do anything other than either generate spam emails or just come up with hallucinations about what actually exists on the internet. But it actually can be used for voice control in a way that previous natural language processing models were unable to do. So I thought this was interesting because it was a nice, happy advancement. And I think that does kind of speak to a little bit different strategy in comparison to what Microsoft and OpenAI are doing, which is just release it. We don't care how broken it is. And I think Google is actually holding the cards to their chest a little bit because they're worried about, they have more to lose by being wrong. Let's just put it that way. So what's everybody's thoughts?
I tell you, so I also had the benefit of going to South by last week. And I just posted a blog this morning about my experience at South by. One of them was robotics and AI, just everywhere. Everybody was talking about robotics and AI. And on the robotics side, what struck me was business cases, real use cases for robotics. You mentioned, elder care. One of the companies that was presenting there was doing mobility at the airport, right? So right now we push people around in wheelchairs by the hundreds. And can imagine if you could have a robot that would pick you up when you get off the plane, that not only would take you to your gate, but would be able to interact with what your experience at the airport wanted to be, right? I want to go to the restroom, but maybe I also want to go to the gift shop and grab something on my way to the next flight because I'm going to see my grandkids, or keep me away from this crowded area because I'm nervous here. So the robotics that have the ability to interact and engage and listen to a real language and quote unquote, think about what's being asked of them, I think is a really interesting use case. So there was a guy there, I had to look up his name, Mike McHale, he's the chief futurist of Deloitte, was talking about AI. And basically, and again, this goes back to something you just said, he was talking about AI, don't think about it like C-3PO, which C-3PO, for Star Wars fans, he's just a wealth of data. He's always throwing things at you, right? You've got this percentage chance of this being successful, and that's not going to be successful. But you have Chewie, who's just the solid co-pilot who's always at Han's side, and all Hans has to do is say, get us out of here, Chewie. And Chewie then, does the calculation. He's not a robot, but Chewie is the loyal co-pilot. And Bechtel was arguing that AI will eventually get us to where it's just a co-pilot that's with the human all the time. You don't have to tell it go 3 meters. You just have to tell it, help me get the green bag moved, and then it can think through. And I think this is a great step in that direction.
I was going to say, when I saw the acronym or the name Palmy, I thought Wall-E on that movie. And now Bob's talking about robots that are going to be flying people around airports, just like in the movie, all the people that were, now some people need that, right? But I think some others just choose to hop on the little thing or say, hey, I'll take the wheelchair, and like slurping their big, Slurpee down as they're getting
bone density will drop significantly. Thanks to this.
But what I thought was super cool about this, and I think what's really significant about it, as little as I understand, admittedly, the science behind it, is this idea of taking multiple sensor data, including the vision, the language, infusing them into robotics in a way that is responsive. Because when you think about, and again, more my bailiwick, drones and detect and avoid technologies, and what we're seeing more and more, a lot of these are kind of visual, cues that they're getting from sensors. And then the brains behind it of, all right, so let's interpret that data. All right, do we have to deviate left or right? That kind of thing. So, I feel like they've been doing this a little bit in the drone world with the detect and avoid technology that we've been seeing.
Yeah, it's the same. This is what's interesting about it, Don. It's the same computer vision library that's probably backing it, the sense of the objects in the world that we would see in the drone space. But
yeah, super cool. Yeah. What do you think, John?
Well, it's interesting. You said that the Palmy and Wall-E. I first thought of oh my God, they're bringing back the Palm handheld.
I thought that too.
I'm getting stuck in the old stuff here. But reading the article, what stood out for me, I like how each of you, Don and Bob, took what it from your own world where you're thinking of. And for me, the classification part popped in, because when I think of AI and the people we talk to with AI within the military electronics space, a lot of it focuses on filtering of data that comes from a sensor. So how do we take, because the human brain can only grab so much. If you're an operator looking at all the data coming in from a persistent surveillance UAS or tether, even a tethered one that's coming in, you can't filter all that in your mind in an 8-hour shift or a 10-hour shift. You got to have something to do it. So adding AI and the filtering and the processing at the sensor level and for classification. So I like the way that kind of talked about that. I think that's where I see it going even more so. AI in our world, I think, has also become a lot of marketing BS. You'll see it. We have AI inside, like the old Intel inside on the old store, right?
That's in all worlds.
It's the AI he's talking about, whether it's C-3PO, whether it's the Terminator. That AI does not exist as far as I know. And then I know ChatGPT. I haven't played with it, but I've heard that it's messing with people's minds. But I think how AI is used in terms, well, there's machine learning, then there's AI. Machine learning could be considered a subset of AI, but AI itself, from our standpoint, our readership, is really helping out in the filtering of data and classification and recognizing what that data is, which touches on Michael's article. That's kind of what Palm E does. Now, whether Google shares that with the military, who knows? They haven't always had a wonderful relationship when it comes to sharing AI tech with the DoD. So, but
Yeah,
we'll look at it.
So this guy, McHale, who's the Deloitte futurist, was talking about whether AI really thinks or not. And a lot of people get wrapped up into whether it's really intelligence, whether it's really thinking or not. And he said, hey, guys, can you ask a submarine whether it's really swimming or not? It doesn't matter sometimes, as long as the outcome is what you want, right? So the submarine might not really be swimming, but it goes and gets the job done. So it doesn't matter if AI is really thinking. Is AI out there doing practical things to help humanity get our tasks done? If it is, then it's something we should embrace and think and figure out how we do more of.
Yeah, but that does open the question. Is it doing what we want? Can you tell it will do what we want? Is the kind of the issue with these models reaching a scale where they are actually technically still deterministic systems. They just don't behave that way because the level of determinism is so complex that we can't actually audit it well. So, for example, that camera is probably really tuned and well tested, but it's still erroneously responding to the quick movement of Dawn's hand as if that's an object it should track. So one of the issues the military faces.
Because I'm Italian and I use my hands a lot, that freaks this camera out. It takes cues from hand signals. So it just flashed blue and I don't know what it's doing now, but at least it's not following like my mug or whatever. So there is that.
So we got 2 comments from the chat. Rotor Dynamics Corp said, hello from Greenville, SC, South Carolina. And then Jamar Williams, friend of the show, and previous guests on Full Tilt. Very interesting conversation. Thank you, Jamar. Lots of conversations today in the chat. Thank you all for participating, and please continue to do so. We're going to move on to the next article, which is Dawn's. More on autonomous systems. So tell us about what's going on in South Korea.
Mike, I was going to say this really is a great segue from your article about this, interface with robots and how they're improving it there at Google. Here we're talking possibly RoboCop, right? Like, so South Korea, they're really looking to transform the country with digital transformation, next gen technology. This is a little article, not just about what the police are intending to do, which, by the way, doesn't just include these, I think they're calling them like night robots, but their police future vision 2050 is to incorporate all kinds of technologies, including self-piloting robots, probably like the one we see in this little picture, exoskeleton suits, self-driving cars, metaverse platforms like the AI Meta Police to police cyber crimes. And they're talking about the military as by next year, introducing what they're calling biobots, things like we talked about, actually, I think, recently on one of these shows. These are robots that mimic the abilities of snakes, birds, and insects. We had the moon snake, right, that we talked about in a previous episode that won a NASA contest. So yeah, so I know the military's been using biobots like the little hummingbird drones and whatnot, but insects and snakes and all of that now too. So really interesting. Some fun facts, everybody. South Korea holds the highest robot density, as a country in the world. They have 1,000 industrial robots per 10,000 manufacturing employees. One of the most automated countries in the world. The robotics revenue in US dollars, they project to go from 1.3 billion to 1.7 billion over the next 4 years. Probably on a track to surpass the global robotics market. And part of this holistically, again, kind of these shows always seem to have a crazy theme or synergy amongst our articles, even though we don't pre-coordinate very much or very well. That, drones and air taxis are a big part of this vision. So, there are emphasis items, and really from my perspective, being an attorney, and dwelling quite a bit today in the policy regulatory world, this was one I wanted to foot stomp. South Korean government is set to ease regulations to bring new reforms to facilitate innovation and business opportunities. And they talk about making some announcements next month on approval criteria, certification, safety standards for robotics. And it sounds like they're going to even include some incentives to promote the utilization of robots across various industries. So all I can say is, wow. So I would love to hear your thoughts. Let's go with John first.
So my first reaction to that last part of what you talked about was, do they have unions in South Korea?
That's right.
That's a good question. I don't know.
Yeah, culturally, I don't know. That's going to be a big thing in manufacturing to kind of really push and eliminate jobs here. That's the first thing that popped into my head when I saw that. When you said that, that's a real difficult political and cultural observation. I know the Korean culture is very different. I know they embraced COVID rules much more quickly than the U.S. did. There's a lot of independence here, and from a business standpoint, basically you're eliminating jobs if you're adding robots. Even though, and I saw at the end of the article, it does make there's a lot of jobs in construction and manufacturing they talk about in your article that are not safe, and there's injuries. They can prevent accidents by having robots do the job. So that's a challenge there. It's a trust issue too, just like with whether you're going to get, like Bob talked about earlier, whether you're going to get behind, sit in a passenger when you have a robot flying you around the city. That's trust. I mean, people prefer aircraft pilots who have gray hair. That's why Sully was such a big hit, right? Because they've had a lot of hours, they've survived a lot of emergencies, right? So, and then I also smiled too, because Bob talked earlier about Star Wars. I was watching The Mandalorian the other night, right? And they have a robot ticket guide on their train, right? So basically you better have a ticket or the robot's going to throw you against the wall or something. So, and who do you sue if the robot hits you too hard? There's just, I love it. It's cool. It's science fiction. It's great. I don't see it getting embraced in this country too quickly.
So I think if I could jump in, I think what makes robotics work in some places is the combination of a business case, a use case, right? And so when you talk about displacing jobs, that's actually a factor that goes into the business case, right? So if a company's looking at a robotics opportunity, they have to decide what's the impact to our union, what's the impact to the local economy, whatever. But you got to have a business case, and then you got to have a leader that embraces and sustains innovation, which sounds like what they've got at Korea is kind of a cross section of that, right? They've got robotics that are ready to work, and they've got leadership that is embracing innovation. One of the recent case studies that I came across at South by is the airport that serves Cincinnati and Louisville. I think it's like North Kentucky Regional Airport or something like that. They've got a director of innovation, and she just embraces these ideas and drives it down to the business case. And she really talked about two that they've implemented very successfully. One of which is just floor scrubbers. They come on in the middle of the night and they clean the floor from one end to the other. And they had a significant human issue with that because it displaced people who came in and did the mopping of the floors in the middle of the night. So they had to work their way through that. But another business case, for example, and I think it ties to this law enforcement issue, is they put robotic dogs on the fence lines. And so they call it a robotic dog because we like to give personalities to our robots. But what it does, it just patrols the fence all the time and makes sure that the fence is intact. And it also has the additional job of taking care of the bird problem that airports have. So everybody knows, for some reason, airplanes and airports are attracted to birds. They come there by the thousands, and they're a significant safety issue. And usually the answer to that is a security guy in a pickup truck runs over there and blows the horn and scares them away. Well, the robot dog can do that. But it also learns where the birds happen to go and what their patterns are, and actually becomes proactive based on its learning to go where the birds are going to be. So I think it's just a matter of finding the use case that makes sense for the business, and then an innovative leader who can kind of drive it to execution.
Well, and Mike, I'm going to toss this one over to you. But before we do, one thing we can't forget is there's been a huge worker shortage. I mean, I think it preceded COVID, but I think COVID exacerbated. And I don't know if people just, at least in the United States, got used to staying home and they don't want to do this job or that job, So we talk about this routinely on this show, this idea of robots or technology replacing humans. Is it replacing, or, to use HAI's terms, with regards to AAM and helicopters, is it complementary? In other words, those night moppers, is there something else they can do that's maybe even a better use of their time? Maybe
Right.
they have to actually oversee the robots, maybe not as many of them, but maybe there's opportunities for some of them to become mechanics to actually fix those robots. I don't know. I think there's a lot of creative ways to make this complementary as opposed to replacement technology, if you will. Mike, what are your thoughts?
Well, I do want to push back on that example of people being trained to become the mechanics of the robots. I think that's like a scene in literally the Tim Burton Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, where that's the job that the dad gets eventually, is fixing the robots that replaced him. That it's often a different skill set for managing these things. I just want to quickly actually bring up. So unions are actually 14% of all workers in South Korea, which seems very high. And it's actually up 10% from 5 years ago. So just as the unions have formed, that it seems like they might be facing some competition. I want to bring up the idea of actually replacing white collar jobs, because honestly, I think deploying robots is actually more complicated than people think. They work in very narrow zones, even when they have intelligent navigation systems, or they work best in very kind of narrow zones. So I think the bigger concern for workers is actually being white collar workers being replaced, because if their job actually can be done, it can just be done. It's not dealing with physics, let's say. I do think this initiative is awesome, though, because when it comes down to it, it shows, I think, a national understanding of how these systems will coalesce. And it seems like they're ahead of the game. If they're just talking about it at South by this month, and the tech industry seems to be rallying around this focus, it seems like the South Korean government was able actually to project this ahead of time. So I'm actually not surprised, because South Korea has been on the bleeding edge for probably the last decade.
I want to say one more thing real quick. As I look at this Police Future Vision 2050, I'm going to throw out a challenge to my buddies at Drone Responders, because, boy, wouldn't it be great for them to put out a vision of what technology can do for first responders? I mean, look, we always talk about public acceptance, going back to our very first discussion today, and the HAI-AAM white paper. But the Rubicon, none of us have really been able to cross, is, no kidding, getting it to the public outside of our own little circles and communities. Like, people watching this show, generally speaking, we might get some random person or two, right? But generally speaking, they're going to be interested in technology and already have kind of an inclination to accept some of these concepts. Getting it out to the general public, I think, is a big deal. And having a group like Drone Responders put out some kind of a vision document that then local public safety folks can go through their grassroots efforts up through right? Municipal, state, other governments, and get the governing bodies and the leadership on board, that's going to be a game changer.
Do you guys, any of you guys actually own a robot? Like a Roomba? Even?
So I own a
do.
Roomba and I hate it. We talked about this before. It bumps into things. I've got 2 Labrador retrievers. Its receptacle is too small. It fills up too quickly when it actually does work and isn't stuck under a chair. So I use it not very much, and it's been sitting in a closet for a long time.
Actually, I've literally found a photo on LinkedIn today that had a woman mopping an iRobot Roomba store front. So she was so that, like, just the symbolism there is you can't recreate that, right?
No, that's perfect.
But it they do work for general, like, quick sweep if you can't get to things. I think that's actually what we need to understand, is that these things will be deployed, but they could be an answer to a shortage at first. They could handle kind of general things like the robot dog example, walking the perimeter. Technically, you could have a human do that, or you could even deploy a robot that's 80% efficient in the task, but can do it more times without getting bored or requiring health insurance. So all of that kind of factors in, right? So yeah, maybe the Roombas aren't perfect, but these are, as Bob had said, co-pilots. They're partners that have certain skills, and they're going to be better at one thing over the other. But as long as they get the job done, then we use them for that job. I think that's really what it comes down to. And it's kind of cool to see a country level initiative that seems not only focused, because anybody can make these grand proclamations, but actually understands the technology. That's what I found interesting. It wasn't just a grand pronouncement that was unrealistic. It was one that was very detailed. So,
yep.
We're coming up on time, Dawn. So, what's coming up this week?
Oh boy, we've got a lot coming up as usual. So let's see. On the Dawn of Drones this Wednesday, AUVSI platforms, we've got Martin Broomhead. He's a UK rep from Defense Solutions, Counter UAS. So check that out. Martin will be giving us a UK perspective, so that'll be a lot of fun. Thursday on our Clubhouse, we've got Jacob Taylor from Indigenous Aero and Chris Howe from the Canadian Advanced Air Mobility Group, talking about some of the advanced air mobility and drone things they're doing up there in Canada. So that'll be this Thursday. And then next Tuesday on our Full Tilt Leadership Podcast, we've got Greg Fortier from SAIC. He's in charge of the Army business for SAIC. So that should be a great show. Check us out.
Yeah, want to get one more comment in from the chat. That's Bob Hawthorne saying hello from Martin, Richmond, Virginia. Thank you, Bob. I want to thank our guests and their amazing articles. Thank you so much for your expertise. Thank you to the audience for participating a lot today. And also thank you to our sponsors. We'll start with Robert T. Hastings for not only his appearance here, but also supporting everything we do. Thank you, Bob, again. Fixar, Speedbird Aero, and
SAIC.
SAIC, who's appearing next week on Full Tilt. So thank you for making this podcast possible. And we are out here.